Chris Bowen, thanks for joining us.
Pleasure. Nice to talk to you.
I think we all understand that there's a need to stabilise the nation's fiscal position, and that to do that's going to involve some difficult and unpopular decisions. If you've already indicated you're going to oppose a number of the key measures in the budget, which will delay or even derail the start of that process of consolidating finances. Is that a responsible position to take?
Well, we are acting responsibly. We're acting in what we believe to be the national interest, and the role of an opposition is not to be a rubber stamp, it's not to be an echo, it's to provide an alternative way forward. So the irresponsible thing for us to do would have been just to carte blanche reject the entire budget on the night. We didn't do that. I indicated on behalf of the party what we would be opposing, indicated there'd be other matters which we would further consider, and some that we would be as constructive as we could be on, and that's the role of the opposition. Certainly Tony Abbott and Joe Hockey weren't backwards in opposing savings when the previous government put them forward. They opposed the indexation of the private health insurance rebate. When we made changes to family tax benefit, Joe Hockey said it was akin to the one-child policy of China, so they didn't provide their votes on many savings measures, and they certainly didn't provide rhetorical support on the need to repair the budget, so we're not going to be lectured by them. We'll provide support where we think it has been justified, where we think it's in the national interest, and we'll provide opposition where we think that is appropriate. I've not only acknowledged, but have said when I was Treasurer, now that I'm Shadow Treasurer, that there is a case for ensuring the long-term health of the budget because of the fiscal pressures which governments around the world are dealing with, ageing the population, increasing health cost example, but this idea of a faux budget emergency requiring these sorts of changes is laughable, and we'll point that out as well.
A lot of the key measures in the budget, and some of the less popular ones, don't kick in until after the next election. Why not let them take those measures to the electorate and see whether they've got a mandate for them?
Well, they're building them into the budget now. They're legislating them now. The Parliament has to vote on them now. This is not a change which occurs in 2017 or 2023 that'll be voted on then when our government's received a mandate. They're asking the Parliament's opinion now. Now, they promised the Australian people they wouldn't do certain things. They're legislating for them today as we speak, and we're asked to vote on them today. So it's a bit of a sop, frankly, to say, oh, there'll be an election first. They are building these things, including the change to indexation to the age pension, which is harsh and punitive. My understanding is the only person to try something similar was Margaret Thatcher when it comes to the punitive nature of the pension indexation that they're proposing. They're building those into legislation now, building them into the forward estimates, and so the Parliament has to deal with the legislation before it now, and so we'll vote accordingly based on what we see as the merits of the proposals.
Chris, I want to take you into a less politically intense space and put to you that what we're really looking at is, first of all, a mining boom, and the Howard government spent during that mining boom, and then the Labor government also spent during the mining boom. But then it stopped. And I think the first person to wake up that it had stopped was in fact Wayne Swan. And he did, and you did too, take a number of steps to begin the process of adjusting our spending to a quite different environment. I'm not sure Tony Abbott understood it, but that's another subject. What we're looking at now is the further adjustment to the fact that we haven't got a mining boom. And both sides of Parliament will have to recognise that.
I don't disagree with that at all. In fact, I recall when we were in opposition last time, pre-2007, us saying you need to prepare for the end of the boom, and Peter Costello laughing at us, and the sort of sniggering as if the boom was going to go on forever, unlike every other boom in world history, of course. Of course it was going to come to an end. And yes, we identified the transition. The language I identified and prefer is the transition from the construction phase to the export phase, which is still good for national income, of course, and still good for export figures, but not so good for employment generation. But we have seen a decline in terms of trade. But interestingly, you saw the impact on government revenue fairly quickly after Labor came to office. Terms of trade stayed strong, but you saw government revenue start to take a hit. Of course, you had the global financial crisis, everybody understands that, but I think you're also seeing some structural changes. And yes, we in office, both under Wayne Swan and myself, did identify the need for structural improvement to the budget. We did take tough decisions, family tax benefit, baby bonus abolition, means testing private health insurance rebate, a multinational tax, even FBT on cars, which were about structural change, and which again the Liberal Party sort of made great political hay in exploiting. Now, some of the actual losses that people encountered were far less than what we're encountering in this budget, but the then opposition was more than happy to make political mileage out of it and didn't respect the fact that there was structural change underway and that the budget did need structural repair.
The structural change is also related to the fact that the iron ore price and coal price has fallen. But both parties went into that last election promising big forward spending, as though the mining boom was still going. Abbott with his parental leave, and you guys with Gonski and disabilities. All, let's agree, they were good things to do.
I disagree that the paid parental leave scheme is necessarily a good thing to do, but nevertheless, that's a side point. I mean, a paid parental leave scheme is important. This one's extravagant and unjustified in my view.
Both parties went into, whether they be good or bad, both parties went into the election with big forward promises, not recognising that the game had changed.
I don't accept that, Robert, because yes, we went to the election promising the Gonski funding model, which we see as a pro-productivity. It's about fairness, but it's also about long-term productivity, investing in people from disadvantaged backgrounds so that they can contribute to the economy right throughout their working life. I see that as an economic reform as much as it's a social reform. We are not getting our best out of our people if people are working under their capacity right throughout their working life because they had an education which was affected by their level of disadvantage. And of course the National Disability Scheme, a way overdue reform, which is a social reform but one which is eminently justified. But we didn't just, this is the great myth that the current Treasurer perpetuates, we didn't just build in the spending, we built in the funding as well. I mean, we took tough decisions, it's all there, there's a 10-year funding plan for each of those reforms. It's all laid out. Not all of our our funding decisions were popular, but we made them. And say what you will about them, some you'll support, some you'll oppose, but they were there and they fund the Gonski reforms, they fund the NDIS, and to suggest, for Joe Hockey to suggest otherwise is just plain wrong.
But against that, you're still in deficit, and the funding is a totality situation. And I'd put to you, and I think it also applies to the coalition and opposition as well, that neither party really understood the implication of the fall in the iron ore price, the fall in the coal price, and the very big fall in mining investment. And I just don't think either of our parties understood it. I think the coalition now does understand it, but that's down the track.
Well, it's very convenient they come to understand it in government. But I've got to disagree with respect. I mean, as you pointed out before, Wayne Swan was talking about it, I was talking about it, Kevin Rudd was talking about it. I mean, I think I remember addressing the National Press Club talking about the mining boom in construction coming to an end. And that was, something which not many people were talking about. And yes, we did recognise the impact of that on the economy and on the budget. And that means a change of decisions. Now, and as I said before, I think we needed to be planning for this before it even happened. We were talking about what do we do with the mining boom ending from 2006, 2007 onwards, when it was still the accepted wisdom that it would go on for 10 or 15 years.
But Chris, wait a minute. To give you a hard time, and I recognise you did pick bits of it up. I'm not arguing there, but you did put a mining tax in that required the boom to keep going, and it didn't keep going, and you'd spent the money in anticipation of it. That was a big mistake.
I fully accept. I accept this point. Australia would have been better off if the minerals resource rent tax had been put in 10 years earlier. I do accept that, and there would have been a lot more revenue for the Commonwealth through the mining boom.
Chris, the budget's been widely described as being quite mean and hitting lower and middle income families and individuals quite hard. But with the structural deficit and a skinny income tax base, is there any other strategy that brings us back into surplus in the medium term that doesn't hit those bands?
Look, I think so. I don't think, again, tough spending decisions are necessary. And there was plenty of criticism when we did things like means test the private health insurance rebate and abolish the baby bonus. But they weren't necessarily called mean. They weren't called heartless, because people accepted that yes, there'd be people missing out on subsidies and people missing out on payments, but it was hardly attacking the social fabric of the nation. And I do think you can make those sorts of decisions, and you might say, well, yes, you need to make more, but they're the sorts of decisions you can make, which were controversial at the time, which do have an impact and do contribute to returning to budget surplus. But things like putting people on, refusing to pay unemployment benefits, New Start allowance, to anybody under 30 for 6 months, I mean, what are these people meant to live on? I mean, where are they going to go? I just don't think the government has understood and comprehended the size of these decisions. I mean, there's just no answer there to what these people are going to do. Are they going to turn up at charities? Are they going to knock on the door of their parents who might be aged pensioners and say, I'm moving back and I need you to put food on my table as well? I mean, how is this going to work? That's just one example. The change to pension indexation would mean dramatic change to the incomes of people on $20,000 a year. I mean, you know, you're on good income, I'm on a good income, most of the viewers of this show would be on a good income. $20,000 a year is not a good income, it's not a generous income, and yet these are the people we're targeting here. Not something I think can be justified by the state of the budget, particularly as the government thinks that the state of the budget can afford sending $50,000 cheques out to people when they've had a baby. I mean, it's just, the budgets are about priorities, it's about decisions. You're faced with a whole range of things. I think you were referring to this before. Whole governments and ministers get given a whole lot of proposals, all of which are worthy, all of which are good, all of which you'd like to do. Budgets are about working out which ones you can afford to do. They've decided we can afford paid parental leave of their design, and they decided we can't afford to index the age pension reflecting wages or reflecting even a basket of goods that pensioners are likely to buy. I mean, that's their prioritisation, not one that we share.
Chris, if the deficit levy gets passed, you and I will be on slightly lower incomes. But I think you said to David Spears, I think, that the old days of jacking up the top marginal rate whenever the government has a problem wasn't sustainable. But do you support the deficit levy?
I don't like it. I wouldn't do it if I was Treasurer. And here's a little tip for you. Every Treasurer has been given it as an option. I was given it as an option when I became Treasurer for budget repair. Wayne Swan I'm sure was given it as an option by the Treasury to say, look, you could do this. We all rejected it. Why? Because in the pre-globalised world, you could jack up marginal tax rates and people had no choice but to pay, really. In the globalised world, people can say, well, I'm off. I'll go to a lower tax regime, thank you very much. I won't come to Australia from the United Kingdom or from Hong Kong or from Singapore. So the world's changed. Treasurers in the past had that opportunity. I don't like it. I wouldn't have done it. I didn't do it when I was Treasurer. We're still considering our position because we're not the government. We're not going to write the budget from the opposition benches, and we're not going to be, so negative that we just necessarily reject everything. And just because there's maybe some things that we wouldn't do in office and we don't approve of, doesn't mean we'll necessarily block all of them. But I just think it's an easy and cheap policy, frankly. It can be justified in some instances. Now, John Howard did it for East Timor, he did it for the gun buyback, we did it for the Brisbane flood rebuilding. There can be instances where a temporary levy can be justified, but just a general revenue repair, budget repair model when you've got a AAA credit rated a budget and you're sending out cheques for $50,000, I don't see the justification.
I assume when you were Treasurer, Chris, that Treasury would have given you advice about how people would respond to a high income levy. And is there a risk that it pushes more high income earners into more aggressive tax minimisation strategies?
Well, I didn't need that advice to tell me that, Stephen. I mean, I think you would work that out. I would work it out. Yes, you're going to see tax minimisation. You're going to see people going offshore. You're going to see less people attracted. I didn't need a Treasury piece of paper to tell me that.
Chris, is there two or three measures that are in this budget that you would stop, and how would you fund those? What else would you do to fund those particular measures?
That we would stop?
Yes.
Well, the ones that we've identified that we will vote against are the GP tax. It's a fundamental trashing of universal healthcare. We'll vote against that. And the thing about this is the government's not using this for budget repair. They're not saying we need this to do this to return a surplus. They're using this for a medical research fund. Well, a medical research fund's great. Wonderful thing. Of course, we'd all support that. But you can't run the case, we've got this terrible budget emergency, so we need to charge $7 to go to the doctor, but by the way, we're not going to use that $7 to return the budget to surplus. We're going to use it for a separate fund. So their argument doesn't, I think they're being too clever by half. They were trying to wedge us and, say you don't support medical research at the same time as undermining their own argument that this is necessary for budget repair. So you ask, what would we do to replace the money? Well, they're setting up a fund which they've chosen to set up, not one that necessarily is one that should be paid for by charging people to go to the doctor. We also oppose the indexation of fuel excise. Now, I believe that'll go through. The Greens will support that, and the government, their numbers together with the government, will see that pass the Senate. That's a matter for them. Tony Abbott railed against the carbon price and doing deals with the Greens for 4 years around the country. Now he'll sit with the Greens to increase the price of petrol. So he can do that. We'll oppose it, but I believe it'll go through. There's two examples, if it goes through, that we'll oppose. One which we stand a reasonable chance of blocking, I believe, and another one which it looks like it'll go through anyway.
Chris, that co-payment, isn't the point of that to discourage frivolous visits to the doctor?
Well, where's the evidence that we've got people who think, oh, I know what I'll do. I'll race down to the doctor's surgery. I'll sit in the doctor's surgery for an hour with a whole bunch of sick people, coughing and sneezing, because I can't think of anything better to do with my time. But if I've got to pay $7, I won't do that. I mean, I just think that's an overstated issue. In my experience, people go to the doctor when they feel they need to go to the doctor. They don't do it for fun. People have got better things to do with their lives generally than go down and spend an hour waiting to see a doctor. Now, sure, there are some people perhaps who would fit that category, but the response of charging every other Australian to go to the doctor to deal with that just doesn't make any sense to me at all. It does undermine the fundamental principles of universal health care. Medicare, frankly, is a success story. I mean, countries around the world look at Medicare and marvel. Look at the United States and their tortuous, intergenerational debate about healthcare, which rages to this day, has raged since the days of Franklin Roosevelt and rages to the day of Barack Obama and undoubtedly beyond. And we've got it right in Australia, and this government seems intent on unpicking it.
Chris, I don't disagree with the way you describe Medicare there, but the cost of healthcare, the cost of the pension, given the demographics, is going to cripple the next generation of taxpayers unless we start doing stuff now. So what should we do?
Well, just note though that we spend less on healthcare as a percentage of GDP than the United States by a massive proportion. So let's not pretend that Medicare here is the problem. In fact, Medicare has been very much part of the answer, and unpicking Medicare will create more problems than it solves. So I just don't accept that there's some sort of out-of-control socialist behemoth here called Medicare, which some on the right would have us believe. That is just simply not the case. Now, yes, we do have health costs are increasing around the world. The technology is getting more sophisticated. We're all living longer. We're all benefiting from it. But high-tech medical care comes at a cost. That's a given. Governments around the world are dealing with that. That's not an Australian phenomenon. And yes, as we all get older, it's a wonderful thing. And as the old saying goes, it beats the alternative. But it's expensive for the nation because we need more health care. So there are pressures there, but I just don't accept that. Again, it's a pretty lazy policy, frankly. Charging $7 to go to the doctor is a pretty lazy way forward in terms of funding the growing medical costs. Now, you asked what our alternative is. There's an election in 2016, and I can assure you we'll be going to the people with alternative policies. At the moment, we vote on the proposals before us, and the proposals before us we don't like one little bit, and we'll be voting against them.
Chris, in the last two elections, the party that ended up being in government made undertakings in the campaign, which they then breached. What are we going to do to make politicians more honest in their election campaigns?
I think that's a really good question, and I think the key here, I've thought about this quite extensively, is being honest with people about what problems government can fix and what problems you can't. Or at least being straight with people about what impact you can have. And I think, frankly, the lessons of this budget is very clearly that all politicians need to be mindful of what undertakings they give and how realistic they are, and having an upfront conversation with people that some problems are being faced by governments around the world, and there are adjustments to be made. And I think there'll be at the next election some respect for that. So I think that your question is a fair one, and I think it's incumbent on all of us. And again, this is what we're seeing play out. The Australian people were promised a return to surplus with no new taxes and no spending cuts over and above what the coalition had said they would do. That was always voodoo economics. I knew it. I'm sure you knew it. They denied it, and it worked for them in an election campaign. But it does eat away at the body politic when that sort of thing happens, and it eats away at trust.
But you did the same thing. Both parties, the carbon tax in your case, but so we've got both parties doing this, and this is not good for democracy.
Well, of course, I mean that we do have, without relitigating history, with the carbon price, there was a hung parliament and an agreement with a Greens party, so there was that discrete issue. On this case, you've got not one promise, but a whole web of deceit, frankly, which went into an election campaign, a whole election campaign designed around promises which are unsustainable and undeliverable. Always were, as I said. You knew it, I knew it, they knew it, but they were always undeliverable promises, and now they're paying the price. And, as you say, the body politics paying the price. The trust deficit is up very substantially. Let me tell you, walking around the community, there is a lot of red-hot anger out there.
But I think it affects both parties. I really think you have to look at this as a total political problem, not a one-party problem. That's not you.
Well, I'm giving you my answer about going forward. I think it is incumbent on all politicians to be realistic about what we can offer, realistic about what problems can be fixed and how they can be fixed. And I think there'll be respect for that. It's always tempting for a politician, of course it is, always tempting to say I could fix this and it won't have any cost. But you've really got to have a mind to your credibility post-election. I can assure you, in Labor Party's policy development process, we are very focused on making realistic commitments about what we can fix and what we can't. We're very focused on what we say now being credible not only now, but hopefully when we form a government at the next election, which we're striving to do. So we're very, very mindful of that fact, and we'll be very mindful of the commitments we give to the Australian people.
Chris, we'll have to leave it there, but thank you very much for your time. We appreciate it.
My great pleasure. Thanks. It's been nice to talk to you.